By the middle of November, I was on my way. After an exhausting train journey, interrupted on numerous occasions by air raids, I reached the parachute service school near Arnhem, but on the German side of the border. The newly established assault battalion of the Parachute Army was also in training here. I was assigned to Hauptmann von Hutz, holder of the Knight's Cross, as an instructor in heavy weapons. However, this experience only lasted a few days. More or less overnight, we heard that all the experienced battle-tried officers would be transferred to the von der Heydte battle group, which days later was to be almost completely wiped out or captured after a drop during the Ardennes offensive. Since my arm was still damaged, I wasn't permitted to go with them. Well, a few months ago, nothing could have stopped me from making the jump, but nowadays I wasn't so wholehearted about it. When I did return to the unit, Commander von der Heydte welcomed me gladly, but then spoke to me very seriously. Herr Poppel, be careful. I've already had a report on your defeatist opinions at the replacement training regiment. We had reached the stage when a line officer could not speak his opinion even within his own circle, among comrades, without a Nazi officer reporting it. That hurt, and only the pleasure with which my comrades welcomed me back did something to ease the pain. After the transfer of the best men to the battle group, the training school was disbanded, and I was assigned as company commander to 4th Company of the Assault Battalion under Hauptmann Eduard Heibner. Plenty of new faces here, and only a few veteran paratroopers. Pleasant, bespectacled Lieutenant Giflelt was adjutant, temporary company commander was Lieutenant Joswig, and Becker and Stefan were Oberleutnants. We didn't get much time to rest. In January 1945, we were moved to Winterswijk in Holland and thrown into the battleground around Roermond and Venlo. Then there were a few quiet days. The Americans managed to capture Aachen, but not to cross the Roer. We held them up there. The river was usually shrouded in mist, especially in the mornings. As a result, we managed to send recce patrols over in pneumatic boats, bring back prisoners and discover details of the enemy units. Our rations were still good, so we gave many loaves of bread to the local people. A lot of Dutch girls hung on to us, went with us, and were to regret it bitterly later on. As far as possible, I talked to these girls and tried to convince them not to. You could already see what would happen. Post from home was still trickling through. My wife wrote to me, "Today we are worn out after this terrible hail of bombs. To be hearing the howling of these things all the time, waiting for death at any moment, in a dark cellar, unable to see. Oh, it's truly a wonderful life. If only it would stop. They really expect too much of people. Do you still remember the lake? I think you gave me our first kiss there. Everything gone. The lovely cafes, Brand and Boning, the town hall completely burned. It's impossible even to begin to describe it. But you will be able to imagine it. You have seen Munich. Is everything going to be destroyed? Yet there is no other way out to be seen. Why do people let our soldiers go to their death uselessly? Why do they let the rest of Germany be ruined? Why all the misery? Why?" On another occasion she wrote, "Perhaps we won't survive until the end. It is certain that there will be chaos then. And that there will be bloodshed amongst us Germans is obvious, but I won't write any more about that. If you were still a loyal supporter of these people after the war, you know who I mean, it would inevitably separate us. What have they made of our beautiful, magnificent Germany? It's enough to make you weep, and one mustn't even think about how the others will enslave us. No, here at the front we mustn't think about it dither. Everything had grown so bitter, and we understood the feelings of the people at home, suffered with them, and feared for our loved ones who had to bear terror bombing. As far as we were concerned, our only aim now was to bring the men back with as few casualties as possible. During the slow retreat, there were already obvious signs of disintegration. Bicycles were desperately needed, I knew, since we were still so short of vehicles. But some soldiers were creating mayhem, tearing up the walls and floors of the flimsy houses to look for hidden valuables. It made my blood run cold. In fact, I beat hell out of one soldier for doing it. I just couldn't stop myself. Our paratroopers maintained at least some kind of discipline and order, but among other units, things were already falling apart. In February, we reached the River Maas in the Räuver-Swalmen region. At this stage we had suffered only light casualties, and the bodies of men killed in action could still be brought back into Germany and buried in Brugg or Bracht. Oberleutnant Becker was killed here, along with the commander of the signal communication platoon, Oberfeldwebel Stengel, then back again to the German side of the river, the lower Rhine side. No more casualties, that was our motto now. All hope of famous victories, the blind obedience, the belief in Germany and the Führer, that had all disappeared. My Batman, a pleasant, fair-haired boy, always carried my rucksack with the American sleeping bag I'd captured, cigarettes and cigars, emergency rations and dressings. One day he told me that his hometown had already fallen to the enemy, and asked if he could push off home to his parents. Although I sympathized with his feelings, I couldn't agree to it. Next night he left with my wonderful rucksack. Sadly, I never heard from him again. At Alpen we prepared for a counterattack to regain Cleve. As we got ready for the attack at Labac-Sonbeck, the big offensive of Canadian, British and Polish armoured units and infantry began. After days of defensive actions and the forced evacuation of Xanten and Isium, the battalion withdrew to rear positions in and around Voen. During this fighting, 3 Company under Oberleutnant Stephan was completely destroyed by flame-throwing tanks in Martinshof. Shortly afterwards, 1 company under Lieutenant Josvig was annihilated between Winstal and Berzien, except for 1 Oberjäger and 1 Jäger. I had taken up a position on the periphery, saw the mass tank attack through my field glasses and couldn't do anything about it. An enemy tank on our flank must have seen something glittering in the sun, my field glasses, and sent an armour-piercing shell over which sent the bricks flying around my ears. My helmet got a dent, but I escaped with no more than shock and a long scar. My carelessness with the field glasses had almost cost me my own life and that of many others. Damn it, something like that should never have happened with an old hand like me. The Reichswald forest was shelled to pieces, shattered, only stumps were left. When the Rhine bridgehead was evacuated, the remainder of the battalion was among the last German units to cross the river in assault boats at Wesel on the 12th of March 1945. My company was still almost intact, and I was proud of bringing so many men back. Meanwhile, the other companies had incorporated stragglers to bring their strength up to between 10 and 15 men. Consequently, the entire assault battalion now had 150 men at its disposal. Astonishingly, the enemy failed to pursue us with sufficient force, or else he could have had us all swimming in the Rhine. As a result, we got across in good order, had a few days' rest and were able to increase the strength of the battalion with men seconded from various Luftwaffe units. I got 2 Hauptmann from the ground crew. I wondered what to do with them, but eventually decided that they could still be used as messengers. Military police and SS were still strutting around behind the lines, full of self-importance. We reckoned that they'd have done better to be fighting, these blokes. At Ries-on-Rhine we took up position, with strict orders to hold the town at all costs against the expected major offensive across the Rhine. Our superiors were quick to tell us to hold Ries to the last man, but they didn't say what with. About 10 kilometres behind us there was a vast quantity of anti-aircraft artillery, but it had the wrong bloody ammunition. What a farce! In Ries there was a bombed-out pipe factory, and we swarmed over the ruins to save a few stems and bowls. We had hardly any rations, and so we were forced to pillage the homes of the rich farmers of the lower Rhine. They still had whole cheeses in their big cellars, at least. Smeared with marmalade, this bread substitute tasted excellent. The houses were almost all deserted, and notes were often stuck to the doors. We are out farming by day and come back at night. That didn't stop the soldiers from taking whatever they could find in the houses, just like they had in Holland. I even caught a teacher thieving and gave him 2 slaps in the face. Unpleasant for him, but definitely better than a court-martial. In the Pulverturm Tower on the bank of the Rhine, I set up an observation post, occupied by Willy Rapp and an Obergefreit. We could use the battery commander's telescope to look through the thick cracks and see the British sunning themselves on the other bank of the Rhine. They were as cool as a cucumber. When Rapp opened fire on them with his 5-centimetre mortar, the Tommies hit back with their anti-tank guns, and my men soon had to clear out of the tower. The enemy offensive began on the 21st of March with a heavy barrage lasting 12 hours. The sky was illuminated by countless rockets and tracer bullets, as if it were a firework display. In the cellar where he had taken cover, the candles flickered and were constantly being put out by the blast. Above us, the house collapsed, so we moved out into the commander's cellar, though he wasn't there. His wife and Lieutenant Giffel were, though. At first we made jokes, but they soon petered out. Suddenly, all our telephone lines were cut. Because of the ceaseless bombardment, the deafening roaring noise, you could hardly make out a single word on the little radio sets. But messengers had to go out to discover the situation ahead. We heard that the Tommies had already crossed at Wiesel, and 500 metres to our right they were crossing with amphibious tanks and armoured vehicles. The young parachute regiment there hadn't been able to stop them, being unable to realign a lot of our heavy machine guns, which we had set up for indirect fire on the Rhine. During this period my men could hardly get hold of any rifles or the 8-centimetre mortars with the long barrels, which we had captured from the Russians. The commander managed to break through to us during a lull in the shooting, but in all honesty there was nothing left here to lead. All we could do was wait for the infantry attack. Now they were advancing on the city from all sides. Then, in glorious weather, a whole armada of paratroopers dropped about 10 kilometres behind us. We were completely surrounded. After the war, the engineer Professor Ernst Ulrich Reuther wrote to me that the horror would have been even greater for the small assault battalion, except for its courage and readiness to let itself be destroyed for its comrades. He was right. We were determined to hang on, not to surrender. The house-to-house fighting raged through Ries for days, from street to street. Hand grenades could be a lethal weapon in these conditions, when thrown over a wall into a group of enemy soldiers. These goddamn Tommies. We were determined they wouldn't get us. Since there was little he could do here, the commander decided to break out and try to re-establish control from a new position. I decided to stay put. The battle for Ries lasted almost 3 days, during which time we hung on grimly and gave our other troops the chance to continue the battle behind us. The Illustrated London News, the 7th of April, 1945. The 1st Battalion, the Gordon Highlanders, cleared the last Germans out of the northeastern quarter of Ries on March 26th. It has been an all-in fight, from street to street and house to house, for 51 hours, against 500 to 600 fanatic young enemy paratroopers. The reporter exaggerated our numbers, perhaps in an attempt to explain why an entire British division had failed to break through. There were maybe 180 of us in all. We sent out recce patrols under experienced Feldwebel and Oberjäger to discover if there was any chance of a breakout, but it was hopeless. Most of them suffered heavy casualties, or failed to return altogether. I discussed the situation with the last Unteroffizier. The Führer order was very much in my mind. If a superior officer no longer appears in a position to lead, he is to hand over command to the nearest rank below. Personally, I was ready to surrender me, who had been a paratrooper from the very first day of the war. Yet although the struggle was completely hopeless, men came to me in tears. As paratroopers, how will we be able to look our wives in the face if we surrender voluntarily? A phenomenon, incredible. I had lived through the incredible inhumanity of war, experienced its highs and for months its lows, the horrors and the hell, and at the end of it all to be confronted by this attitude. Then, after long silence, they said that if the old man, it would have been funny if it wasn't so sad, that I was the old man at the age of 24. If I thought we should surrender, then they would follow me. It happened quickly. I gave the order to hide all valuables and to put on double clothing. My batman asked me if he could break open an officer's chest. Yes, I took an anti-aircraft officer's good cloth coat, may he forgive me, and a briefcase in which I put my few belongings. Waving a white cloth on a broom handle, we emerged towards the Tommies, who were advancing on our last position. A hefty sergeant and a whole load of Tommies kept their submachine guns trained on us, and only stopped being afraid of a few paratroopers when they saw that we weren't carrying any weapons. We were surrounded, frisked, and if anybody was careless enough to be still wearing a watch, it was quickly taken. Bloody fool I was. I had reminded my men to hide their valuables, but had failed to take my own advice. The fighting was over for us at last. First of all, we were taken through the shattered streets of Rees to the Oldencott tobacco factory. There were very few survivors from the light infantry companies and the staff company, and my 4 company again had fewest casualties. All the officers except me, was I too cowardly, too careful, too clever, were dead. I had time to exchange a few words. Then we were taken across the Rhine to fields which had been fenced off. On one side the Unteroffizier and other ranks, and me on the other side, completely alone like a cow in the pasture. A lot of men quickly shoved their paybooks under the fence so that I could promote them. I promoted all of them. No ordinary soldier has ever been made an Oberjäger so quickly. Whether it was for prestige or for increased prisoner pay, I didn't mind. I was taken to an omnibus completely filled with files. A British captain speaking good German told me, "Now we've got you, we only need Hauptmann Huber." Then he took a file, skimmed through, and read out details of the positions of the battalion, my own career and our casualties. Fairly accurate right up to the last day. Well, that's certainly one way to wage war. When they took us away, we drove past kilometre after kilometre of Allied artillery positions, thousands of guns. With us, it was always sweat saves blood, but with them it was equipment saves men. Not with us. We didn't need equipment, did we? After all, we were heroes. They transported us through Holland and Belgium on open goods wagons. The people there, bitter at their fate, threw stones at us from roads or bridges, but not many reached their target. Vae victis. The long years of war had so demoralized us that we had nothing left. They could do with us whatever they wanted with us. Along with a few others, I was picked out and brought to an airfield. We were taken to London in an aircraft filled with wounded Tommies to begin our period of captivity. I think it was called Wolverhampton Park, the place where I spent 10 wonderful days. My own room, white linen on the bed, my own Batman, ham and eggs for breakfast. Then interrogation. For 2 hours every day, a British captain, he had studied in Heidelberg before the war, talked with me. Not about the war as such, not about the operations, weapons and equipment. Instead, he wanted to see into the heart and soul of a young, and in his opinion still fanatical, officer of Hitler. He was friendly and matter-of-fact. Gentlemanlike is the term we use in Germany too, offering Chesterfield and Woodbine cigarettes. I didn't care what he thought, and I said things as I saw them. He tried patiently to show me the evil of the Hitler regime, but failed because of my obstinacy and a kind of blind Nibelungen loyalty, which still held me in its grip. I had survived, but I didn't see any reason for me to crawl to these moneybags, however friendly they were. I wasn't going to say to them, "You are right, of course you are right." Only, they were right, although I did not know it then, or didn't want to admit it. In those early days, I still couldn't see how the German people had been misused. But my fiancée had no need to be afraid any more. In February, she had written to me, you see, to tell me that, if you were to remain a loyal supporter of these people after the war, you know who I mean, then it would inevitably part us. In all honesty, women have more understanding. We men had been educated to stubborn, blind obedience. By the end of the war, I had certainly become more critical, but cured. Completely cured, -1 was not. However, it was not to take much longer before I recognized the truth. The game of interrogation ended, and I spent a short time in a small camp. Small, but with the best of company. One-man U-boat operators, frogmen, Waffen-SS, some paratroopers, apparently all black. Translator's note, that is, regarded by the Allies as fanatical Nazis. Yet somehow the interrogating officer, I recognized him on the television in 1981, had discovered some spark in me and had noted it because, along with some others, I was transferred to the Whites and moved to another camp. The train travelled by night. A pity, because we couldn't see anything. We got out in Newcastle, not far from the border between England and Scotland. On the Tyne there was Featherstone Park, a big officers' camp for 3,500 people, near a boarding school in a castle which had once been acquired by Lord Nelson for Lady Hamilton. A forest of Nissen huts, each containing 50 men. We had a rough time for a number of weeks, but let's face it, we could hardly expect hotel accommodation. There were some fine men, good comrades among the prisoners there, but there was also a whole crowd of dirty little rats, especially among the middle-ranking staff officers. If my faith in German people had already been crumbling before, now whole walls of conviction started to collapse. We saw fat obersts bending down to pick up the glowing dog ends dropped by British sergeants, even running and scrambling after them. We saw men denouncing others and being denounced by them, and all this was happening among men who were supposed to be officer comrades. For many of us, it was the end of all our illusions. A fine mountain infantry Hauptmann, whose shoe shop in Munich's Augustenstrasse I was later to patronize frequently, was denounced by fellow German officers for some thoughtless remark he had made. A few days later I saw him again, covered with bandages and plasters, all his front teeth knocked out. The notorious sergeant thugs had really beaten him up badly. Or take our East Markers, the Austrians. East Mark was the Nazi name for Austria, after Hitler had annexed it as part of the German Reich, translator's note. Well, we could understand it when one of them came to us and said, "Listen, if say I'm loyal to Austria, then maybe they'll let me go home earlier." That was in order, but 80% of them were now contemptuous of us Germans, as though their men and ours had never fought and died together such a short time before, or as though we had never exchanged friendly Heil Hitler greetings. The Hungarian officers were different. They stood loyally by us, though God knows they were no Nazis. No, in that camp I saw the whole world's collapse. There were not many paratroopers there. Their army was already in Valhalla. After a while, a new camp commandant arrived, an older colonel who had been a prisoner of the Germans in both the First and Second World Wars, and had been well treated by them. In return, he was determined to be fair to us. Our rations and camp life also improved. After the film about the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, we were forced to watch in a nearby cinema. We also had more understanding for the beatings we received from Jewish guards. Knowing what they knew, what cooperation could we expect to get from them? But the new commandant had been a soldier all his life, and he regarded us as soldiers too, not as Nazis. German assistants were soon assigned to the English camp police, and I was among the men who used this opportunity to improve my English. Soon the prisoners were allowed to take complete responsibility for camp patrols. At the end of 1945 we were also allowed, under supervision, to go in groups into the nearby village. Jesus, the people here were poor. Oil lamps, open fires, wretched houses. No wonder that the Tommies were keen to get hold of everything that we had. Even simple pens found a ready market. In the great colonial empire, it seemed that only the high society was wealthy. Through the good offices of the commandant, we gradually smartened up our camp. He got hold of dye-stuffs, bags, chests, materials and tools for use, and we used them for handicrafts, transforming the huts into attractive, light and homely dwellings. We made armchairs, cupboards, panelled furniture and much more. One day I tried to make a chair, but one leg was always too short, so I sawed so much off that eventually I ended up with a footstool. We organised competitions to spur ourselves on to more civilised living, and after my captivity I would have been happy to have lived in such an attractive little room. Even the noise of the card players around me didn't matter. Notoriously stubborn as ever, I was still determined to bone up on my English. The generous supply of materials allowed us to create stages, reading rooms, rooms for religious worship. The last were especially well used, particularly as there were army chaplains among the prisoners. Many adherents of the Nazi Church found their way back to their true God during this period, and why not? Personally, I had left the church during the war and had never prayed for my life even during the worst moments. Even today, I still have no need for any church. On the 4 stages we built, a program worthy of a thriving city was being offered. The Gypsy Baron, Die Fledermaus, Frau Luna, etc. We managed to stage them all. The few women's roles were acted very artistically, without seeming ludicrous or mawkish. In the next theatre there were classics such as Richard III and Don Juan. In the next we laughed at popular shows like The Gasman or Johann Has an Idea. Lively orchestras too. One man in a room nearby was a real gypsy and played the fiddle. There was chamber music on Sunday mornings, music for strings, and dance music in the afternoons to make us forget everything and transport us into the dream world of home. But the most important creation was our Ministry of Education and the Arts, which offered high-quality teachers and professors and an excellent programme of study. Courses for holders of the school leaving examination, for the occupation of landlord, including practical work in the kitchen, for structural and civil engineering, for the breeding of domestic animals. At home we would learn to value this knowledge, for architects, student teachers, bookkeepers, doctors. Everything was on offer. Courses of lectures in at least 10 languages. I took Portuguese of all things, lectures in history, history of art, social sciences and economics. All these courses, and we were avid to learn, to satisfy our starved brains. But it was not only our spiritual and intellectual needs that were catered for. We could also volunteer for labour duties which, according to the Geneva Convention, were not compulsory for officers. But we were desperate to get physical work, since then you could get out of the camp and get in touch with the local farmers, who could provide us with many extras. The men from our room reported for road building work on an airfield. That was, or at any rate soon turned into, quite an experience. We were allowed to work at our own discretion, without any supervision. You Germans can do everything anyway. You'll do it right. It was foggy in the field, and I thought I'd take the chance to have a look around. There was a barracks there. From the window, pretty British girls in uniforms offered me cigarettes, and we talked. A comrade had given me a cigarette case he had made, so I was keen to give this in return. One of the girls was so thrilled by the pretty box that she gave me half a packet of cigarettes. That's really something, I thought. I kept it to myself for the rest of the day, and only told my comrades about it when we were back at camp that evening. Of course, the incident had given me an idea. We collected half a sackful of our handicrafts, went to the barracks again the next day, and came back with packets of cigarettes, coffee, tea and chocolate. The girls were especially keen to have little puppets, so we tailored supply to meet demand, and I organised the manufacture of these figures on a kind of assembly line in the barracks, the heads from papier-mâché and the clothes from remnants of material. But selling from hand to hand like that wasn't good enough for me. I wanted to do it on a much grander scale. Once I'd managed to convince a sergeant of the guard, with a little assistance, of the benefits of this business, I had it made. As a result, I opened my shop on 2 long tables in the guardroom. Just imagine it. And it flourished. This happy state of affairs lasted for a week, but then our good commandant decided to pay a call on his road builders, and, unfortunately, he walked straight into my shop. This was definitely going too far. The shop was closed, and I, escorted by soldiers, received 4 weeks' confinement to barracks and a reduced cigarette ration. The last of these punishments wasn't too hard to bear, though, since I already had stocks laid in. For weeks there had been an obstinate latrine rumour that we were soon to be released. However well things were going, the idea was always in the forefront of our minds. Our rations were now excellent, plentiful and good. The porridge, often with raisins, tasted wonderful, and on Sundays we got 4 or 5 slices of cake. Every month we could order any clothing that was missing, and it was usually delivered promptly. Almost all of us possessed his own dyed English suit and shoes, and we could get our washing done in English laundries for a small fee. When we thought of home, we couldn't imagine that things could be better there. But we wanted to go home. We wanted to build, to work. English newspapers were available, and we translated them avidly for the latest news from home. The post, that magic word, produced hope and dread, joy and grief. For many of our comrades from the Russian-occupied areas, for our East Prussians, Pomeranians, Silesians and Sudeten Germans, there was hardly any news at all. They still didn't know whether their families had got out, or even if they were alive. Their heads dropped when one of us got post, and they had to hide their tears and their fear. I had managed to write my first card months before, when the Morgenthau plan was on everyone's lips. It said simply, "Healthy, everything all right. Hope the same with you." On the 12th of November 1945, I received some post from home to say that everyone was well, and finally, on the 17th of January 1946, A card arrived from my fiancée to say that she was all right too. A great weight was lifted from my mind with the news that everyone was still alive. I wrote immediately to say that Gerda should go with her brother from Magdeburg to Otterbrunn, as they'd be safer there. She was anxious about my parents, who were Nazis in a very minor way, and she told me how she hoped that the current pathetic outbreak of slander and abuse among the Germans would end soon. The food supply was poor, and they were just hoping to survive the summer and autumn. The news from home, gleaned partly from letters and mainly from English newspapers, was so disturbing that we prisoners found ourselves writing to tell them, "Chins up, we're coming soon." An astonishing transformation had taken place, encouraged by the fair treatment we were getting. At the end of the war, we were completely demoralized, but after some time in captivity, we began to grow stronger all the time. Somehow the spirit of battle had been reawakened by the sufferings of home. Perhaps we were just stubborn, not prepared to accept the collapse of our world, the devaluation of all values. In any case, we were drawing new strength from these setbacks. The vast majority of us were soldiers, often credulous soldiers, but not executioners and not monsters. We had been committed to Germany, but now we had to find new meaning in our lives. Each one of us would have to struggle alone for himself and his family, without being able to stand shoulder to shoulder with other soldiers, without the comradeship of proud elite troops to support us. But there seemed to be no prospect of repatriation. England needed its galley slaves, and broken Germany was giving the remainder of its sons to provide them. One of them hanged himself, a teacher, Nazi official, father of 3. In flight from his feelings of guilt, cowardice about his life and despair that he couldn't fulfill his responsibilities towards his family. Today the subject of table talk, tomorrow forgotten. One day I joined the Democratic Working Group, the object of much derision among the POWs, as an end in itself and out of interest in its goals, especially in economic reconstruction. Since everything had been destroyed, bombed, demolished, then perhaps, but only perhaps, we might get the chance to become competitive with the most modern machinery. We'd see. My third interrogation did not go well. Paratroopers, especially those he thought were committed to the Nazi church, were too much for the good civilian, who was still convinced that the wolves needed to be reformed. There is an expression which is highly appropriate here: go and kiss my arse. On another occasion, I paid one more visit to the camp doctor, Dr. Newman, because of the injury to my head. This brought on another dose of repatriation-itis, of course. The following week I was to be examined by an English doctor at a clinic in Newcastle. Keep your fingers crossed for me. Material from an essay or an idea I had? The prisoners among themselves. If anyone thinks that the life of the prisoner is steady and calm, I'm afraid that they're very much mistaken. Perhaps some of you believe that life behind the barbed wire brings out the best attributes of the stronger sex, and that true manliness is revealed because the prisoners are not subjected to the pernicious influences of women. If so, I'm afraid I must disappoint you. God gave man a wife for good reason. Men amongst themselves and under such hard conditions seem to need to outdo each other, to act as a mirror image of the divine Zeus. But what are they really like? Poor figures, wretched products of nature, playthings of the ego. Only in the field is man worth something. The composer was not a POW, otherwise he would have celebrated the men behind the barbed wire. Now to comment on the individual POW. He showed himself best, and most clearly, as a being capable of adjusting to any situation. You could say that he had developed into a chameleon. Youths became men, grown men grew childish again like schoolboys. The warrior turned meek as a lamb. The Nazi party bigwig was transformed into an eternal democrat, etc., etc. The ability to adjust was the secret, and was the key to the repatriation camp. There were lone wolves and crowds, small groups and larger bands of like-minded men, stupid men and intellectuals, as well as those who thought they were, notorious layabouts and hard workers. Many people moved between these categories. They belonged to one group for some time, switched to the next, and then returned to their old group. Slowly but surely, each one shed his skin. There was plenty of time for such thoughts behind the wire. Yes, I could understand them, although today comprehension comes only with difficulty, and I saw a special danger that even the good men among the blacks might become embittered as the years pass, increasingly sterile and irresponsible. When we looked around, what room was there for such defiance, just a pinprick against a wall of steel? They may have dreamt of a secret German resistance movement, but that wasn't real soldiering, it was just playing at soldiers. The armies of occupation wouldn't tolerate anarchy, and God knows they had the means to impose their will. Comrades, this wasn't the way. We needed men to roll up their shirt sleeves and get to work on reconstruction. Germany had had enough of cops and robbers games. Personal responsibility, which the Führer took away from us, could no longer be avoided. There were other differences between whites and blacks. Often the whites were bureaucrats, these completely innocent men who never killed anyone or even caused anyone injury. They had only removed a couple of trains full of booty from the occupied countries or brought a couple of trucks out full of old Napoleon. There were even general staff officers among them who somehow managed to claim that they had nothing to do with militarism. A crazy world. There was one further group. I've already written about the Austrians and the Hungarians, but there were also the Bavarians, not many, but some, who demanded the re-establishment of the old Bavarian Republic. For them, Hitlerism was a Prussian invention. Maybe so, but wasn't Munich the birthplace of the Nazi Party? The most harmless among the foreigners were the supporters of the Rhenish Catholic Union. They fluctuated between wanting their own constitution, rule by the Frenchies and papal dominion. They were idiots. Now for the Greys. About this group there was no real agreement. Their previous political history might perhaps have been assessed as good, but it wasn't outstanding. Nevertheless, they were hopeful, always excessively polite, protested their innocence, and claimed that their membership of the Nazi Party was forced on them in order to secure their livelihood. However, this group also included many men who could honestly listen to reason, realize the truth, and admit it. You could call them political pupils on an advanced course of retraining. And now for the blacks. They created a class among and for themselves, and were the masters, the proud ones, the idealists. Not one bowed head, not one democratic whimper, only discipline and order. They allowed themselves few hopes of an early return home and lived for each other, calm, heroic. They did not realize and had no desire to understand that they were lying to themselves. For them all explanations were a swindle. The war and its end were the unjust judgment of the world, and the Nazi system remained their ideal. On the Führer's birthday, they appeared in their smartest uniform, with white gloves if possible, stood to attention and thought in silence of their leader. Once he had been mine too, but was so no longer. What was especially tragic was that these idealists were often potentially among the best men. They withdrew from life and thought that this made them better Germans than the rest. They didn't see that the best men were most desperately needed at home, not the bootlickers and the disloyal ones. But with their attitude, with their Nibelungenstilk loyalty, they hadn't got a chance. People with no faith in Germany's future had to make plans for their parents, brothers and sister, wives and children, for their friends and their wounded comrades. They had to plan for the future, but not try to evoke and recreate a defeated past. Many of these blacks seemed to me like children who want their broken toy mended, not like men who could draw new strength from mistakes and setbacks. But I could understand them. After all, in 1943 I displayed the same stubbornness towards the man who was later to be my father-in-law during a visit to Magdeburg. There was a big globe standing on a desk which he pointed to with his finger, showing how small Germany was, and then made a large circle. And do they want to conquer it all? This comment didn't go down well with me. I was a proud lieutenant in the paratroops in those days. Without my mordant sense of humour, I think I would have despaired. It wasn't life as a prisoner that had this effect, but the intentions and well-meaning plans of the occupying powers. In my view, the Russians were behaving like Asiatic hordes, as the English newspapers confirmed. We were offended when the French sent Negroes from Senegal to occupy our homeland. We thought America was sadistically bent on destroying us. Only England seemed to be pursuing a benevolent policy, but only a policy. They should have followed it earlier under their great Churchill, and not let the Russians advance to the Elbe by demanding unconditional surrender. Did they think that Stalin, a worthy and more cunning successor to Ivan the Terrible, would ever leave the areas he conquered? It wasn't just communism, but also the ancient Russian drive for expansion. I wasn't gloating because I'd made more than my share of mistakes, but the Churchills and Roosevelts did not behave in a European way. To give up half of Europe because of Hitler and to hand it over to Stalin, that really wasn't grand policy. Germany suffering from inflation, hunger, cold, plunder, powerless and without honour. Vansittart was raging, de Gaulle made bittersweet speeches, and Morgenthau wanted to turn us into day labourers and peasants. The Anglo-Saxon world raged at Moscow. Too late, Moscow yapped back. They had what they wanted. The Russians had reached the Turkish border. Liberated politicians were fleeing, from Poland, Romania, etc. A witch's Sabbath for the whole world. I'm sure I could hear Satan laughing. Emotions fluctuated as the weeks passed. Pacifist and bloodlust, hedonist and recluse, communist or anarchist, sometimes even Democrat. Everything unripe, there'd be no harvest until we got home. Our model Democrat Hans Thaler, manager of the sales articles for soldiers, embezzled a packet of tobacco. Not that this was anything out of the ordinary among our little officer elite, nor that I was shocked about it on that account. But we all knew about his character, the way he denied his Germanness and his democratic whimperings. The most astonishing thing about the whole affair was the opinion of our camp leader, Oberst Primus. In his view, the embezzlement of such a feeble little packet was really not so terrible, and he dismissed Thaler with honour and regret because of the lack of proof. Was that an officer's spirit from a serving officer? Oh, my Germany, what has become of you? My birthday was celebrated rather more noisily than I originally wanted. I was woken up by music from my comrades, and my roommates gave me coffee and cigarettes. Actually an indirect invitation to a coffee party. Teddy Schott turned up with a lively three-man band, and everyone had a wonderful time. Summa summarum, I was left with 5 cigarettes, and the swine had swindled us out of our tobacco ration for 3 weeks. Christmas. A short, effective and profound speech from the prince of our hut, Hauptmann Brechlin, followed by Christmas carols, poems and stories to put us in the right mood. Amazing and fortunate how these little festivals could help turn our community's pain into joy. Mauer was very successful as Father Christmas, presents with both material and sentimental value exchanged. There was a great deal of singing and laughter. But the best time was when Schroeder played his harmonica as we lay in our beds, hands crossed behind our heads, dreaming of home. That Christmas we produced a Christmas newspaper, including a comic poem about me, describing me as a communist-hating pacifist who tried to evade all orders of whatever sort, but particularly when they involved my turn at firelighting duty. Soon after that, the first 100 of our wounded and sick were on their way home, getting the repatriation they deserved, poor blokes. I was due to go to the doctor again, determined to keep on trying. But then we heard that in summer a large number of us would be released. The craziest, most exciting and detailed rumours circulated and multiplied. Of course they were passed on in secret, because their author was determined to extract the last cigarettes in return for his information. But, and this was new, we heard there was an actual list with release dates for Groups AK, who were to be repatriated by June. This included, first and foremost, more wounded men and the permanently sick or disabled, along with older men and boys. And then, a bittersweet secret. Nobody knew what would happen after that. Politically reliable men, or men with specific professional skills? Men selected by zones or by age? Our spies couldn't find out for certain how the repatriation lists were designed, what the groups meant. Anyway, it seemed certain that none of the groups would apply to me, except perhaps the one for the wounded. I was a paratrooper, 25 years old, a German Christian, former leader of a Hitler Youth unit, although in only a minor way. Surely that would put me in groups, however the lists were compiled. That night I dreamed of travelling to the coast in a heated carriage full of hope. Damn this shit, damn these rumours. Next we heard that 3,000 brown battle dresses had been ordered, without patches. This could surely only be to go home. And last of all, the commandant was supposed to have said that the interrogations should be over in 7 weeks, which must mean by mid-March. So if I was really lucky after all, I could be skiing in the fields near home that month. There was a sensational article in one of the newspapers shortly before that. The Zurich newspaper Weltwoche of the 16th of November 1945 was describing life in the territories now occupied by Poland. The Swiss correspondent specifically stated that he was telling the absolute truth. He wrote of the land of death between the Vistula and the Oder, a land without law and justice, without human dignity. The Germans outlawed, hunted, killed, plundered, raped, starved. Many typhus villages are hermetically sealed off from the outside world, no assistance for them. Corpses in rows in the streets, children less than a year old starved to death, little girls and women raped. Fair game for organised gangs. People who didn't leave voluntarily were starved out, and those who remained were outlawed. No judges, no authorities, no police helped them. Mass flight and mass death. This was the fate of the German population in purely German areas, not even in Polish ones. No comment necessary. Girdle, my little blonde girl, why didn't you walk in stocking feet to Munich? To think of you among the Russians was unbearable. Later I was to find out how women and girls disguised themselves, smeared themselves with filth to avoid attracting attention. One man from our hut, Lieutenant Schunk, was a Sudeten German. Where could he go? I told him that after he was released he must come to me in Bavaria. The ones like me, who were lucky enough to live in the US zone, we simply had to help wherever we can. In all this hatred of everything and everybody, you simply didn't let a good comrade down. The 8th of March, a memorable day in my life as a POW. In the evening I was told that I would be sent home in the next few days. An incredible thought. I just couldn't grasp that I was going home. Home at last. I couldn't believe it, and pinched my cheeks to make sure that I wasn't dreaming. But it was a fact. The order was there. I could write page after page about this moment, about the hopes and feelings connected with it. Home, a magic word. I was cruelly woken from my daydreams when our War Criminals Club teased me, telling me that I mustn't believe it, not for a moment, since it couldn't be true. These rats to make me full of doubts. Everything okay at the clothing parade. I met Major Newman, the Red Chief of B Camp, who was also going home. Next morning we were among the 60 men standing in front of the camp commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Vickers, with Captain Sulzbach translating. Translator's note: Herbert Sulzbach was born a German Jew and served in the German army in the trenches during the First World War. Forced to flee Germany to escape Nazi persecution, he served with the British Army during the Second World War, and after its end worked in prisoner camps for reconciliation and understanding between peoples. He has been awarded decorations by several countries, including Germany and France, for his efforts. Lieutenant Colonel Vickers told us that under his leadership and with our good conduct, the camp had improved its position. 6 months ago, the camp had still been surrounded with 3 tanks of high barbed wire with watchtowers. Today there was only a wire fence, and we were permitted unsupervised walks up to 8 kilometers away. Sport, conversation and work had made our lives as prisoners more tolerable. After 2 wars, he saw it as his life's task to treat German officers decently and to send them home as quickly as possible. When educating our children, he hoped that we would remember the immense suffering of these 2 wars and teach them to be friends of peace and friends of England. We must come together. These words, spoken by an honourable soldier, made a deep impression on us. Even the most inveterate enemies of England would not forget him, nor what he said. I didn't say much to my comrades. I can understand how they felt. An old Hauptmann said that it would be unjust to send the boys home and not him, an old man. I couldn't help remarking that he should have gone to the front to make sure he got a repatriation wound, which would have solved his problem. I exchanged addresses with my comrades and I packed my gear, giving my stuff away wherever possible. Then my friends gave me a last poem, with an attractive border and comical illustrations, about my Bavarian blood, my eagerness to go on courses in the camp, and telling me to remember them when I got home. Let us shake you by the hands, and when you are at home enjoy. Think back and remember us, all these fine fellows. As young as I was, I had to leave them behind, hoping against hope that they would soon be following me. 3,500 officers should have been a real elite. Many were not worthy of that, but the others, the few, made up for them. By train to a camp in the south of England, next day on a Liberty ship, in its enormous belly we all looked for somewhere to sit, daydreamed, still almost unable to believe that we were crossing to Germany. The Elbe, Hamburg, disembarkation. On the 20th of March I was already in Munster transit camp. The mood here was almost unbelievable, completely apathetic and hidebound. There were a lot of older men, many old officers, shabby to look at. I was almost ashamed that I once wore that uniform. Perhaps the mood was a consequence of the impression that we received even at the station. Everywhere there were just women and boys working in patched old uniforms, examining bricks, searching through the ruins for anything that could be used. Then the train journey with its unending procession of shattered towns, villages, factories. For all our joy at coming home, the sight made us draw in our breaths. We passed numerous goods trains full of machines, all destined for abroad. It made us fear for the future. But who knows? Maybe this removal of the machinery from all our factories would be for the best. Maybe one day we'd be able to beat the others hollow with our own brand new machinery. At the time, this defiance felt like whistling in the dark. The city was dead, but life round the barracks continued with its own weird vitality. Tommies walked around in all their finery, with collars and ties, a German Fräulein on their arm. Elsewhere, groups of people were just standing around and talking, some speaking of another war. The prevailing tone was of misery. What was there to lose that they hadn't lost already? And there were black marketeers, cigarettes dangling from the corner of their big mouths, waiting for customers with eyes drooping and almost closed. Cigarettes here cost 7 marks a packet, a day's pay. Who on earth could afford that? Farmers and peasants, mainly from the lost territories in the east, were easy to recognize with their sturdy frames and clumsy movements. What did folk do the whole day long? Why, they just watched other people. Our own administration here in the camp was useless and indifferent to our fate. Most were young lads, real braggarts who would rather sell our rations than look after us. After all, they told us, we, not they, were the people who prolonged the war. Little wonder that we were more hungry than we had been for a long time. To feed 100 men there was biscuits in tins, handed out after half a litre of dreadful ersatz coffee, reminding me how delicious the tea was in merry old England, had been poured into each man's tin, jam jar, or even mess tin. At midday, half a litre of milk, watered down of course, a wafer-thin bread soup. In the evening, 3 slices of bread, 20 grams butter, 50 grams vegetables, and that delicious broth again. After a few days, many of us, including me, found that when we got up in the morning, everything went black in front of our eyes. Lethargy tended to spread. Many men stayed in bed or dozed the whole day long. In the daytime it was better anyway. You could at least sleep. In these 2 barrack blocks there were at least 2,600 men, with 200 men crammed into each room. No light, no oil heater, no beds, not even plank beds. Each man lay wrapped in his blanket on the hard floor. Some snored like horses, others wheezed like men with diseased lungs, somebody else let off a fart like thunder. Now if you were very unlucky and got a bloke with a diseased bladder behind you, then things were really bad. He'd have to climb over everyone in the middle of the night, was sure to hit somebody in the ribs, step on someone else's finger or toe. Then there'd be a real row. Lift your legs up, you stupid oaf. Haven't you got eyes in your head, you arsehole? And colourful dialect oaths from some of my fellow Bavarians and Swabians here. When the culprit finally got outside, everyone simmered down and we'd all turn over and try to snatch a little more sleep, until the next man had to go out, since this went on for half the night. When we woke up, we were all still exhausted. Only the bravest men among us could face going out to wash. There was a stable with long wooden benches, where between 800 and 1,000 men had to fight in the dark for the 4 taps. Consequently, many men didn't get up until later, or didn't bother to wash at all, making do with rubbing a face cloth over their eyes, and then the stink when they emerged from their blankets. God, it certainly wasn't a perfume counter. I felt particularly sorry for the sick, the mutilated, and the cripples, because they had it hardest of all. In this place, where nobody knew anyone else, nobody helped anyone else either. Each man was his own nearest and dearest. What had happened to the ideal of comradeship? Over in England, things had gone well for us, and even the few men from Russian camps said that they were treated at least halfway decently. Many of the men with gastric disorders, rheumatism, amputations, had already been waiting for weeks in the most appalling conditions. It was just a transit camp, and no one felt any responsibility for conditions there. I was surprised that the British didn't intervene, since they were so fair to us over there. In the queue for rations, things were really insane. You had to watch for the queue jumpers, the crafty types, who would push stealthily forward if people didn't stop them. A lot of people always went short because they failed to curse and swear whenever the man distributing the food made a tiny mistake. The queue jumpers had it off pat. He's got one spoon too many, or my soup is too thin. Why don't you begin with me? Or, I've only got a small mug. He had another one in his other hand, behind his back. Not surprising that one of the helpers flew off the handle once and threw a full tureen of food into the face of one of the noisiest moaners. But all that good soup going to waste. I decided to make a move. It worked, and I got some of it for myself, even though it was only lukewarm. The cold food was distributed in a calmer atmosphere because nobody got second helpings of that, except for the biscuits, when everyone was careful to ensure that nobody got a crumb too much. Are animals as brutal as this? If the weather was barely tolerable, we got out in the yard to walk on 1,000 calories. Otherwise we'd have got too fat, of course. Then one of the proud possessors of cigarettes would get one out and blow the smoke gleefully under the noses of all of us with none. There was almost murder done then, these plutocrats. If you tried to ask for one or do a swap for one, no, it was always the last he had. But occasionally a comradely type might get hold of half a fag, and then he'd strike a match and pass it round to share. You could recognize the good old soldiers, because they steadfastly continued to clean, polish, and wash their gear. Many of them still had a chessboard, like me, or a pack of cards. When the men weren't sleeping or dozing, they gathered into groups to discuss things, but we didn't have intelligent conversations. It was better to talk about gardening, breeding of small animals, rabbits, since we would soon need these skills, or about distilling and the cultivation of tobacco. There were eminent authorities on these subjects among us. A lot of people just stood at the window, dreaming of the freedom we all longed for. At the beginning of April it arrived, in the shape of a goods train to transport us to the American zone, prepared for about 1,200 men. The accompanying staff were drawn from among our own ranks. We were just short of a bugler, so I immediately stuck up my hand to volunteer. If they only knew that I'd never so much as raised a cornet to my lips. Anyway, I went with the others to a catering coach to help with the distribution of rations. It was fair. There was plenty left over for everyone. And as we were all starving, we spread the butter deep and thick on the biscuits and stuffed ourselves. Like the others, I quickly regretted it. On the 5th of April we reached Cassel. The weather was beautiful, though a little cold. Tracer, Marburg, lying prettily among the hills. Bad Boyheim was less shattered than other places. People waved at us as we passed. In Hanau the fruit trees were already in blossom. Incredible what a difference these glorious red and white flowers made. Our mood of offspring and homecoming grew, and was further encouraged when the people in Gießen stood waving to us, making us feel genuinely welcome home. At the station they gave us newspapers and piles of cigarettes, and we repaid the children by giving them crisp bread. At one level crossing, dozens of girl factory workers were waiting to see us, to the delight of the thirsty soldiery. That afternoon we passed Aschaffenburg, and then our last camp of Babenhausen, still in Hessen. It was a tented camp under Polish supervision, but with SS staff. Here things were dominated by order and discipline, where before there had been none. And American standards of hygiene, with disinfectants in the latrines, delousing stations, DDT cabins, adequate washing facilities, and then the rations. In the morning we got semolina. At lunchtime there was thick pea soup, in the evening white bread, sausage and cheese, and genuine pure coffee. That's right, real coffee. Unfortunately, I didn't get to eat many of these delicacies. I was stuffed so full of that damned butter that I was forced to set up my personal encampment right by the latrines, which I visited almost continuously. Those 3 days were absolutely, literally, the shits. I was completely worn out, finished. On the last day, I finally began to enjoy that wonderful army food. Then we were told to report for our discharge papers. Although we were prepared, it was still quite an experience. A couple of 100 men in 3 rows, carrying rucksacks, sea bags, cardboard boxes, or just holdalls. I had been able to save my sea bag, still fairly tightly packed. First rank 5 paces forwards, baggage on the ground. What was I seeing? Supervised by beefy US sergeants, the bags were being emptied, and everything that seemed necessary for our freedom was taken away. A groundswell of muttering, which died away again in the fear that we might not be released after all. What brave little lambs we had become, we wolves. But I was still able to judge the situation coolly, a talent that I'd either been born with or had learned in the war. When the friskers came to the end of the first rank, I simply took my baggage calmly in my hand and walked cheerfully forward into it. By the right, quick march, and we were outside. I was free and still had my nice full sea bag. I've often laughed about this delightful trick. They should have known, you can't treat an old paratrooper like that. The rest is soon told. A last handshake. Good luck, keep in touch. And a couple of us boarded an army truck which took us to the station. A tall Negro with a big friendly smile was our driver. Train to Munich, then on foot to the other station, the Ostbahnhof. My home city, once so beautiful, lay in ruins. Though I had become hardened to such sights, I wasn't ashamed to cry. Starving, careworn faces, clothes patched 1,000 times, amputees on primitive crutches, old women carrying things home through the ruins on prams or little handcarts. But also, in many people, the desire to rebuild. Large numbers knocking down the walls of ruined buildings, fetching pipes and everything else that might be of use, knocking the old plaster off bricks. Nobody recognized me in the little slow train to the suburb of Otterbrunn, tanned with a jaunty moustache, in my black prisoner of war uniform with my shabby old cap pulled down. Who on earth could recognize me? When the train approached the station, I grew so scared that the sweat broke out on my forehead. Were they all still alive? Was my parents' little shop still standing? It was still there. I had come home. Oberleutnant Martin Pubapel, company commander in battalion of the Paratroop Army, reporting back after 5 years of war and 1 year in captivity in England.